My name is Logan Williams, and this is my presentation for No Longer Human by Junji Ito. The creative team for this book, originally it was written by Osamu Dazai. The adaptation that I looked at for the library assignment was created by Junji Ito, but that is based off of the English translation by Donald Keene, and it was published by Viz Media. Now, if you look down below me here, you can find an image of Junji Ito during one of his book releases. Now, we've gotten this creative team out of the way. Let's take a look at the story structure. So, No Longer Human is a traditional graphic novel. It does follow the three act structure with a beginning, middle, and an end. Now, Act 1 starts on page 1, obviously, but it does end on page 242. Act 2 starts on page 243 and ends on page 412. And Act 3 kicks off on page 413, but it ends on the conclusion of the book on page 616. Now, the actual narrative is 616 pages. However, there's a couple extra pages tacked on at the very end to show some translation notes and some overall other more translation related stuff. And the story is centered around Yozo Oba. He does go through a full character growth, and the climax that we see in Act 2 does push that further into Act 3 to where he does get his full circle moment. Now, Oba does and does not complete his goal. It's a strange one. As I was reading through it, it was kind of hard to focus on just one main goal for the main character. What I came across was his main goal is to really just survive. He wants to be normal and make it through this messed up world. This is a very gritty, unpleasant story to read through. I thoroughly enjoyed it, but it wasn't a very pleasant read. And in Act 2, Yozo seems to be hitting a emotional climax that's pretty heavy. And we get to see his whole interaction with internally in his mind through all of that and see kind of how that affects going into Act 3 and then affects the overall ending of the narrative itself. It was a really pleasant surprise at the end of the day, despite how unpleasant it was to read through it. Next, let's take a look at the transitions. On our left, we have moment to moment. On the middle, we have scene to scene. And all the way on the right, we do have subject to subject. Now, out of all the transitions from Scott McCloud, I found the two most prevalent in this narrative to be moment to moment and subject to subject. Scene to scene, there were a few good examples. I was struggling a bit to try and find a good example to show for you guys because a lot of this story, as I mentioned earlier, it's very mature, it's very dark and gritty, and doesn't really have a lot of appropriate imagery to be able to put on display for everyone. And then I did look, but sadly I could not find any non sequiturs. But it is what it is. Nothing to scoff at. Just got to keep going. Now let's take a look at the left and go to the right. For our moment to moment transition, it follows our main character when he was a lot younger. Now, before I start on this, I will preface there will be a slight trigger warning because, as I mentioned, this is a very graphic story. The guy on the right in the images, he is assaulting our main character when he was a child. And this is one of the pages that it goes through it. And I was debating having this be a action to action transition rather than a moment to moment, but I felt that the author Junji Ito was more focused on the severity in the moment rather than the severity of the action that was going on. And so for me, it felt better to put it on the moment to moment side. Now, on the middle for the scene to scene, this takes place shortly after Act 2 starts. And it's during a monologue from our main character, and on the top images he's going through some of his previous struggles through Act 1, and it gives us a nice establishing shot of the island that they're on before introducing two newer characters, as well as changing the location to be a small village rather than the outside shot of the island, establishing that change in scene. And then lastly, for the right, the subject to subject, as you can tell throughout all of this, it is a lot of faces going back and forth, swapping between different people, because they're all having a big conversation, and it is going between the POV is shifting on the different subjects. And lastly, these are my concluding thoughts. Would I recommend this story to a classmate? Yes. I think that the critical side of No Longer Human is insanely good. It is something that I think everyone should give it a chance. If you With the caveat being if you have a strong stomach and you can handle the more graphic mature side of this story, because it is not easy. It's not for the faint of heart. It's very unpleasant and not really fun. I didn't have a moment in the story where I was eagerly awaiting to turn that next page because I wanted just to keep seeing what was going to happen next. It was more so of, yikes, I've got to turn this page. I didn't. It's not really. I wasn't having fun, but the narrative kept pulling me along. I needed to know what happened next, regardless of how heavy it was getting. Now, would I recommend this novel to my friends? Not necessarily. I know my close friend group pretty well, and I know this type of dark, mature narrative storyline isn't really something that would suit them. So I would skip over recommending it to my friends. But a nice little fun fact is that I found actually when I read the back of the sock, um, No Longer Human is widely regarded to be a self or a partially autobiographical look on Osamu Dazai's life because it was published shortly before, or at least the original one was published shortly before he did take his own life. And that extra weight going into it, or that I then found out afterwards, had I known that going into it, I do not think I would have had the same effect of it, because knowing that I thought it was just a random suspenseful story, knowing that it was actually somewhat autobiographical really changed my perspective on the story looking back on it. And I hope everyone enjoyed my presentation on No Longer Human by Junji Ito.